Hello, everyone. My name is Caleb Woolston, and I'm currently an honor student and undergraduate research assistant studying under Dr. Anu Osnaani in the Treatment Mechanisms, Community Empowerment, and Technology Innovations Lab. And the background of my research today is that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, can be a unique disorder and kind of complex. The background literature suggests that about 70% of the general population will experience a traumatic event at some point in their life, but a relatively small percentage, only about 8 to 15%, will end up developing the disorder. So this naturally will create a question as to what separates those who develop the disorder from those who don't. And one of the factors implicated in that, in the role that maintains PTSD symptoms, are safety behaviors. And safety behaviors are covert or overt actions used by those with PTSD to escape distressing feelings or places. And a couple examples of these would be someone who's traumatized from, say, a mass shooting will always be scanning the rooms for threats, or they'll be sitting next to exits to make themselves feel safer. And the idea here is that some safety behaviors will only make one feel safer, but the literature suggests and implicates safety behaviors as maintaining these post-traumatic symptoms and interfering with exposure therapy. Additionally, some other background research suggests that there can be a discrepancy in how patients themselves self-report their safety behaviors and how observers like a clinician or an experimenter measure these safety behaviors. And so there exists a need to examine how these safety behaviors present in those with PTSD versus those without PTSD, and see if this is one of the factors that influences whether someone may develop the disorder or not. So in order to do this, the hypotheses for this experiment are going to be threefold. So one, we expect that there will be a significant correlation between the variables of both observer-rated and self-reported safety behavior reporting in individuals endorsing exposure to trauma. And then two, groups with some PTSD symptoms and probable PTSD will have significantly greater number of both types of safety behaviors. And then lastly, there will be expected difference in reporting discrepancy between the types of safety behaviors, and it will be statistically associated with having probable PTSD. And so the methods we use for doing this, we use the SBAF-9, the Safety Behavior Assessment Form 9, which is a well-supported safety behavior report. It's a self-report measurement that has 4 subscales. It has a vigilant subscale, health subscale, a social subscale, and a post-traumatic stress disorder PTSD subscale. And we also looked at the total score here. We also used the trauma film paradigm, which is compilations of car accident videos which have been designed to elicit a trauma-like response. And on that note, since this was an exposure to potentially traumatic feelings, we did offer counseling if those that viewed the trauma videos, if they needed it, we did offer that. And the study was backed by IRB. And for assessing PTSD, we use the PC PTSD-5, which assesses for trauma history and then for trauma symptoms. So basically, the first question asks if someone has experienced a traumatic event. If they say no, we classified them as no trauma history. If they said yes, but they only had 1 or 2 symptoms of PTSD, we placed them in a group of trauma exposure but minimal PTSD symptoms. And then if they had 3 or more PTSD symptoms, we placed them in a group of probable PTSD. And I want to emphasize here that we're not actually testing for PTSD. It's not actually extensive enough for that. But for simplicity's sake, this is what we used for grouping up our subjects. And then in our lab, we had observers coding safety behaviors used while they were viewing the trauma film paradigm. And statistically, we use correlations for hypothesis 1 between the trauma exposure and the safety behavior scores. And then for hypothesis 2, we used an analysis of variance between the trauma exposure groups and the safety behavior scores. For hypothesis 3, we used a z-score of the observer-rated and the self-report SBAF total score. And we used ANOVA with pairwise comparisons to find which group was associated with this safety behavior difference and discrepancy. And so after running the correlations for hypothesis 1, we actually found no correlation between the safety behaviors or any of the trauma exposure groups. For hypothesis 2, some of the safety behaviors, only the health and total score, were positively associated with trauma and probable PTSD, where probable PTSD has higher SBAF scores. It was not true for observer rated or for the other SBAF subscores. And for hypothesis 3, when we z-scored the observer rated and the SBAF data, we took the difference between that z-score between each group, and you can see that graph there in the upper right corner of my poster. As you can see, the probable PTSD difference between the two scores is significantly higher, and we confirmed this by pairwise comparisons. It is not the case for no trauma or those with trauma but no PTSD. The only group that has the difference in discrepancy is the probable PTSD group. So like I mentioned, contrary to our expectations, the safety behaviors were not correlated with just having a traumatic exposure. This was one of the more unexpected findings of the study. It was not related to having a traumatic exposure, and consistent with past work, it's more likely linked to actual PTSD symptoms. Hypothesis 2 was partially supported. As I mentioned, only health, the PTSD, and the total SBAF scores were linked to a traumatic exposure. However, hypothesis 3 was fully supported, where probable PTSD was linked only probable PTSD was linked to a discrepancy between the two reporting methods, as I mentioned, you can see in the graph there. So safety behaviors in those with PTSD may be more covert compared to those without. That's what this data is telling us. There may be an evolutionary adaptation that those with PTSD have developed to hide safety behaviors while in public, possibly to avoid stigmatization. And this, of course, reinforces literature showing there exists a need for empathy and education on how PTSD safety behaviors may manifest as opposed to those without PTSD. Because what this data is showing us, this difference shows that the self-reported safety behaviors are significantly higher than what the observers are catching or measuring using observer-rated methods of reporting safety behavior. So some future directions and limitations of our study. Some of the strengths I want to go over first. We did use some well-supported measurements, and video coding was the coders were licensed by a licensed clinician to measure trained by a clinician to measure safety behaviors. And some of the future directions we want to examine, because like I mentioned, the PTSD, it doesn't assess for actual PTSD, only probable PTSD. And so using a measurement that does assess for PTSD would be a little more solid, but for simplicity's sake, we went with the PTSD-5. And some more of the limitations, we were limited to college students in this study. We had an overrepresentation of upper class students. And one of the major ones is the trauma film paradigm. The trauma film paradigm possibly only elicits a car accident trauma. It's designed to elicit a trauma response, so we believe this would be limited. But those without car accident trauma, but those with a different type of trauma may have presented a little bit differently, and that may look a little bit different if we recorded them with like a different type of trauma. But like I mentioned, that we believe this effect is limited. And anyway, that is my study. Thank you for listening. I want to thank Dr. Asnaani, Manny Gutierrez Chavez, and Kieran Cower for helping me out with this study. And thank you all for listening.